Hello, everybody. Welcome to October's live book club. Today, we are joined by Zoe Tavares Bennett. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
Awesome. And she is here to talk about her book, The Son of God. But before we get started, I'm going to put a quick slideshow up just to talk a little bit about what SASA is, what our mission is, who we are, and all of that fun stuff. So let me just pop that up here. So again, we're doing a live author Q&A with Zoe today to talk about her book. And come on, load. There we go. So what is SASA? Save Ancient Studies Alliance. It exists to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper pasts, building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. We work toward our goal of inspiring a wide, inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. You can follow us on pretty much any social media platform. We stay pretty up to date just about everywhere, promoting all things ancient studies, including lots of awesome free events and stuff like that. So definitely follow us on social media. So just some live event, common courtesy protocols, just be kind and respectful in the comments. We are live on YouTube and a couple of other places. So if watchers have any questions at all, please feel free to leave comments, ask questions as we have our discussion. We definitely welcome that. Just ask thoughtful questions. Please be patient with the technology. There's a little bit of a lag that I've noticed a couple of times on my end, so please just bear with us with that. Again, we are live streaming on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, and our live events are recorded. So if you want to share with a friend, please do, or if you want to rewatch our live event, please feel free on any of our platforms. And then if you want to become a recurring donor, if you love ancient studies yourself and want to support our mission, please continue to RSVP to our events. And you can also sign up for a monthly donation if you choose as well, or a one-time donation. And I think I'll be putting up some QR codes throughout the event to enable you guys to do that more easily. And then that is it. So we're going to dive right into the questions. Let me fix my screen. There we go. Alrighty. So my first question for you, Zoe, is in your own words, can you tell us what the Son of God is about?
Yes. So The Son of God is about Gaius Octavius. It's set in ancient Rome right after Julius Caesar is assassinated. It's about Gaius Octavius's rise to power as Emperor Augustus, which is the name we know him most by. And it's also about power, politics, marriage in that era, and how it all sort of gets interwoven into one of the most significant periods in Western history.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a fantastic description. So what drew you to Octavius and Agrippa's story initially?
Well, I was studying at the Centro, which is a school in Rome, and I was studying the Res Gestae, which in Latin literally means the things I have done. And Augustus wrote that in the year he died, laying out everything he did. And it's sort of a dry document for those who know it. But I was sort of fascinated by this 19-year-old. I was like a few years older than him at the time. And I was like, I can't imagine rising to power like that. Like thinking at 19, I'm going to go and I'm going to, use the army and I'm going to become a consul. And I'm talking with Cicero and Mark Antony and, going to war. I couldn't really imagine that. And then also I was really interested in the propaganda, the mask that Augustus, the later Augustus, weaves around his entire life. And I wanted to know, who is the person behind that mask, not just the historical figure. And then he has a really interesting relationship with Agrippa, They've known each other for a long time. They're sort of school friends. And Agrippa stays loyal to him his entire life. And he dies before Augustus. But it just seems like Agrippa is a military man. He's really successful, but he never tries to take power over Augustus. He never goes against him, unlike, Rufus, one of their other friends from school, gets sort of silently executed. Maecenas, another school friend, supposedly falls out of favor with Augustus later in life. So Agrippa's the only one who sort of remains the entire time. And I was just, curious about that kind of sacrifice and friendship, or even maybe more than that between them, and that kind of like steadfast loyalty, and how it might compare to an actually historically attested love affair between Mark Antony and Cleopatra, where they end up sacrificing their lives for each other's love and also political alliance. So, I mean, yeah. There's
so much juiciness with like all of that. That entire plot line just sounds amazing. And yeah, I love I have had the thought myself, like just looking at like famous historical figures who have accomplished so much in like a short time, like Alexander, for example. I think like he died when he was like 34. And so like when I turned 34, I was just like, what have I done with my life? Like I was like, wow, like you have like this great figure who's accomplished so much. So I really appreciate that point of view, reading his paper, I guess, that he left and feeling that way. I love it. So that brings up kind of a great lead into my next question. And that is, where did you find your source documents? And did you find any websites or archives that you didn't know about previously, and or any ancient sources that you found particularly enlightening during your research?
So when I was reading the Res Gestae, I mean, I had a couple of years of Greek and Latin under my belt, and I was beginning to understand Roman history, but I was sort of coming from it like from a beginner's perspective, I guess. So I had to do a lot of research on my own. The research, the primary and secondary sources that I was using were Suetonius, Appian, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio. So the problem with these, and also Cicero's letters, but I'll get to that. Because these other historians, they're famous. They have, they wrote these amazing histories, but they're not like our history textbooks. They're actually probably closer to what I wrote, a historical novel. I mean, they probably had access to archives and other documents that are lost to us now. So it's hard to say how accurate these histories are. But for example, Suetonius, he was born about 50 years after Augustus died. And that's sort of a long time. So he wasn't like contemporary. He wasn't writing in the moment about what was happening. So you have to take into account that some of these historians wrote hundreds, like way later, and under an imperial regime that Augustus created. So obviously they were like had to be loyal to him. So they couldn't be, saying anything. But I also used Pat Southern's Augustus. Not many people know the book, but she basically lays out in chronological order, which is really rare for history textbooks sometimes, the events of his life and all the sources we have and all the archaeological evidence, every possible little thing. She lays it out chronological order. And that was so helpful for me because when you're writing a book, obviously time happens chronologically. It doesn't happen in nice thematic sections about, Augustus and Roman art or, Augustus and propaganda. It's like, no, I need to know where he was on August 12th of this year. I need to know.
Yeah.
So that was helpful too. I think what surprised me the most about these sources was definitely Cicero's letters. They're amazing. Everyone should read them because they cover the time before Julius Caesar was assassinated and up until basically Cicero's death almost, when he's killed by Octavius and Mark Antony. So these letters are interesting because they're one of the only documents we have that were actually written by a person of that time. And they're talking, he talks about a lot of things in those letters. It's not just purely that political situation, but you do see the kind of tension that's rising in the Senate. You hear about, Julius Caesar's assassination, and you see the aftermath, Mark Antony trying to seize power. And then sort of close to the end, this little boy, puer in Latin, how they called Octavius, sort of comes into the picture. And Cicero doesn't really think much of him. And I think that shows more than the other historical sources how random, accidental, and strange it was that this 19-year-old boy suddenly shot up to power, because you see in Cicero's letters, and he didn't have the privilege of hindsight like we do, how dangerous he was going to become. You don't get that. You get actually the sentiments of the time, which was that this random boy's here. Maybe he'll be useful to us. Maybe we can use him. And that's sort of what you get from Cicero's letters. So that was really helpful for me writing about the time and not writing a hindsight, historical text about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So if I was to want to read Cicero's letters, is there a volume out there somewhere that has them all compiled and translated and everything, or are they online?
There's a free website, which classicists are probably familiar with, Perseus. And they have almost every ancient document in the original Latin and also in or Greek, depending. And they have also a translation. Sometimes it can be sort of an archaic one, but oftentimes they're the ones that are they're good. They're gonna tell you what's going on in those texts. So Perseus.com is, I use it, so it's helpful.
Okay, that's awesome. I'm definitely going to check that out, because yeah, that's source gold right there. For sure. Cool. So let me pull up my questions again. Okay. So, and maybe the letters kind of touch on this next question. So one thing fascinating about your story that you incorporated was just how prevalent the divorce rate was. And just it just is I need a better alliance, so I'm going to divorce you and I'm going to marry this person over here. And it was just lickety split. And I was like, wow, I knew divorce has been a thing forever, but just the prevalence of it kind of surprised me when I was reading your story, and how easy it was, at least for the males. Were there any restrictions, gender wise, or timelines or justifications that had to be met for divorce?
So it's interesting. In the history of Rome, it's hard for us to understand, because in our own culture, divorce wasn't always so easy. So it almost seems like we went backwards in a way, and they were actually more progressive on this front. But in ancient Rome, early ancient Rome, so going far back, it was only the men who could divorce. So this is before Augustus's time. Only the men could divorce, and they did have to have some kind of grounds to divorce, some reason, whether it be infidelity or I don't know, something like that. I'm sure it probably depended. I'm sure there were men who divorced just because they wanted to. But I think there was a sort of social stigma at that time, okay, well, you shouldn't really be divorcing, so what's the reason? And then by the 1st century BC, so by the time of Augustus, women could also divorce on a certain ground. And I think that, so now men and women can both divorce, but within social reason. So you didn't want to do something outrageous. I think things are still pretty traditional. But as time goes on, and that's, that now that's in place, the reasons get flimsier and flimsier until you get to this era where you're it's just left and right. But I think one thing to remember with this time period is, first of all, especially in the Son of God, these families, these people are the elite of the elite. We don't have really too much of an understanding of divorce at middle class, lower class, other people. These are the elite of the elites. They were marrying not because of love, 99.9% of the time, but because of these familial and political alliances that they were making. So when you think of it like that, there's a lot less, there might be a lot less drama in terms of heartbreak, although there are instances where that does happen. But most of the time it's like, okay, this isn't working. I need another political alliance. I need another family. I don't like you. This is just not working. And it's not so dramatic. But we do have to remember that also Octavius, once he was consul and he sort of, bribed himself, like he used the army to coerce that position of power, he's sort of a special case at this point. He holds so much power, he can really do whatever he wants. And so when he forces Scribonia, the day that she gives birth, it makes me wonder, I think people just let him do that. And then the whole story goes is that she was awful. He hated her and she was, horrific, blah, blah. And so that was the grounds of divorce. And he was so in love with Livia. And it's like, well, of course, but also, he was so powerful. No one was going to stand up to him. So there's a lot of things going on, but essentially those are some reasons why it was so prevalent.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering if it was mostly like an upper class thing too. Like, did this also happen a lot for like middle and lower classes, or we probably don't even have any records or anything for them.
And even if we had records for like lower than the elite, there's still going to be more, up there than,
right.
Like
the average Joe.
The average Cassius or the average.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe the average Gaius.
The average Gaius. Yeah, I love that. The average Claudia. But yeah, so that's really fascinating. I really loved having those questions as I read your story. So along those lines, you've woven a lot of cultural details into your story beyond just that aspect, but like you include like festivals and other gender roles and relationships that took place, architecture. What was the most fascinating thing in your research or even in your learning just for your degree that you were just like, I want to make sure I include this thing in my story?
Us talking about marriage and divorce, I think goes nicely with this because I think what fascinated me the most was learning about those gender roles and about women in history and as historical figures and also as people. Because in the historical record, you do see women everywhere in Rome and Italy. So they are there, but history doesn't tend to value or like lift up and obsess about their thoughts and what they're doing the same way that they do about like Mark Antony, Cicero, Augustus. So you don't get that much. And so there's a lot left to the imagination, which was great for me as a writer because I sort of had free reign to try to bridge those gaps between the historical record and, what they might actually be thinking. So I weave in a lot of female perspectives into the story. And the ones who fascinated me the most were Octavia, Livia, and Attica, who get a lot. Cleopatra's there too, and so is Scribonia, and so I think one more, Claudia. But Octavia, Livia, and Attica form sort of this trio sisterhood kind of thing because Octavia is Octavius's sister, and then Livia is Octavius's wife, and then Attica is Agrippa's first wife. So they were around each other a lot for sure. History doesn't tell you that, but we know from how we live that you hang out with your brother's wife and your brother's best friend's wife. And I'm sure they were taking care of the kids together and everything. So what was interesting to me was thinking about, for example, Octavia. She has his first husband, Marcellus, has 3 kids. One of them, the son, is going to play a really important role as Augustus's potential heir, although he dies very young. So that's a huge drama. But she ends up either divorcing or he dies. His first husband, we don't know. I had to make a guess. I guess that he died. She ends up waiving the grieving period, cutting it closer, and marrying Mark Antony. And I don't think enough people know that.
Yeah, that was a shocker for me too. I was like,
and you're like, oh, Cleopatra, of course. And it's like, well, actually, the whole time he had a guess what? They were busy. They had 2 daughters. So, contrary to what, some people like, imagine you're married to Mark Antony. Mark Antony was a huge figure, like huge personality. people called him a drunk. He was like a barbarian, you know, but he was also like, you know, in charge of formidable force. He was the lover of Cleopatra. I mean, I wonder about him. And he marries Octavia. And I just was trying to imagine, what would that be like? And then you're raising his kids, and she ends up raising way more of them once he dies, and she sort of gets control of some of them. And she also plays a role at the negotiations between, more than once, but the famous one was at Tarentum, between her brother Octavius and Mark Antony, her husband at that time. So she's playing this sort of negotiator role between them when their alliance is quickly crumbling. She's the link between them. That's a very interesting social, political role to play, where you have to sort of, you're negotiating on behalf of both, sort of, you know, you have your husband who's the father of your children, but also you have your brother who you're ultimately loyal to, and you're trying to navigate that.
And still be a mom.
And still be, yeah, of course, still be a mom, take care of the household and do all of that other stuff. That's like, you know, easy. So there's that. And then Livia also was really interesting. So Octavius married her because she came from this well-respected traditional Roman family, gave him a lot of like street cred, political cred. And I think she probably married him because she maybe saw that he was going to rise up and he was powerful. And in the end, she might've been thinking, well, I want my kids to be powerful too. And she really wanted Tiberius to be his heir, the next emperor in line. But, you know, Augustus didn't want that at all. He had like 3 or 4 options before Tiberius. He was like, let me try Marcellus. Oh, he died. Okay, Lucius. Oh, he died. These are sons of Agrippa. Try to get them in. They died. And whether Livia had more of a hand in those deaths is up to debate. Either way, she succeeds in the end by having her son, who's not Octavius's biological son, just stepson, end up being the next emperor. So I like to think of her as a very like political, but also familial. She's, you know, fighting on behalf of her kids and her vision for her family, her line, you know. And then Attica, the final one, that was, you know, played a pretty important role in my book, although not by history standards. She was Agrippa's first wife. He ended up having 3. So yeah, and many children. But with her, he had 2 daughters. She is the daughter of Atticus, who is Cicero's best friend and who most of Cicero's letters are addressed to. And it's possible also that Atticus was the one who published those. He stayed neutral during all these civil wars, but everyone knew he was Cicero's like best friend. And Cicero actually gave Attica Atticula, her little diminutive nickname, because she was so much like her father. So she is a sort of, you know, you don't hear much, but you hear that and you're like, well, so maybe she was actually learned. Maybe she read, you know, maybe she was sort of like into philosophy. Maybe she was conversing with Atticus and Cicero at dinner. You know, maybe she was actually an interesting person. And then you think about how she would deal with Agrippa, who is part of Augustus's, you know, little clique, little, you know, political party, who killed Cicero. So you can imagine her being like, basically Cicero might be somewhat of an uncle to her, and he's killed by the man she's going to marry. And, you know, does history talk about that? No. But when you're writing her perspective and you have to think about what thoughts she's having, that comes up and you're like, wait a second, she's marrying basically her uncle's rival, like one of them. So it's very fascinating once you get into the women, where you don't have a lot of information, but you're trying to piece together what their lives might have been like. And I think it does fill out the story and tell that other side that always seems to be a little lacking, you know, that day-to-day experience that builds history.
That is super fascinating. And that's one of the things that I noticed too, as I was reading, was just like how these women were thrown into the middle of sticky alliances. Like, I can't imagine Octavia being too thrilled to be Mark Antony's wife. Maybe she was, I don't know, but like just that tension between Mark Antony and Octavius and being stuck in the middle could not have been a fun place to be. And then, yeah, mentioning Attica with, you know, between Cicero and Octavius / Agrippa, and just being stuck in the middle and quite helpless, really, to do anything to change anything, really. And I think there's real tragedy in that should be explored more. Like, you know, like, how did Attica feel about that? Like, when you go back home and you're like, oh, my husband murdered my favorite uncle, how does that, like, what does that do to a person, having to live with somebody that kind of betrayed you like that? And looming over all of that is like, you know, I have to be loyal to the Republic and what the Republic needs, and this and that. And there's just so much interesting details in that. And yeah, I found that fascinating.
Like, in that time, the elite families all knew each other too. So this is not just restricted to these characters and how they reacted with each other, because all these elite families in Rome, it was such a small community. I mean, they were intermarrying constantly. So I imagine that these kinds of scenarios were like, I'm married to this guy. It's sort of a political alliance, but it's awkward because, you know, my uncle died because of this and that and this and that. And you're like, you know, I imagine that a lot of people were experiencing similar things, although obviously this is one of the most famous examples because it happens at this turning point in history from the Republic to the Roman Empire, which completely shaped Western history and some of history beyond those borders. Forever.
Yeah.
So.
It would almost make a great reality TV show.
Well, I was like, it's a novel for sure.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if somebody was just to take the concept of like all of this drama
and make it into a sitcom
and just modernize it and make it like a reality TV show, that'd be quite entertaining. Yeah.
Octavius goes to the camera and like, Canfield Scrivoni another day.
Like The Office, ancient Rome.
Yeah. Scrivoni looks at the camera.
I love it. I love it. Okay, so there's so many characters in this history and so many different political facets, as we were just talking about. Can you share, from a writer's standpoint, how you crafted the plot and the manuscript and how you kept track of all of these pieces? Because this is comprehensive. Like, if somebody was like, oh, I want to know what happened to Octavius and like all that stuff, I would just hand them this and be like, this is all you need. This is it. This is all you need. And you know everything. So like, how did you keep that straight?
Well, I'm trying to think if I definitely started with, I'm a big outliner in everything. Okay. So that, I mean, if you're not going to outline, I don't think this book is possible.
I don't think you could have pantsered this.
No. I had to be like methodical about it, but I definitely had a huge historical timeline devoid of any of my imaginations and fancies about what happened. So it was, you know, taking from all these historical sources, taking from past Southerns Augustus and other articles I had been reading, tidbits, you know, about this and that theme, you know, marriage, divorce, this specific negotiation, what happened. I mean, there's millions of scholarship about it since, you know, the end, since the Roman Empire, basically. Since this time happened, people have been writing about it. So you build this huge timeline. You have to know everything that happens. And also, you have to keep track. This is something that I didn't think I was going to need to keep track of, but I quickly realized I need to keep track of the kids, because people, the marriages and the kids, because people were getting married and having kids left and right. And it was really, in history, you know, history has is notorious for sort of brushing aside and being very blasé about these kinds of things. You know, they can, history texts can be like, oh yeah, she married and had 2 kids. And I'm writing that year and I'm like, okay, well, her having a marriage and then having a kid, at least by my standards, is a major shift in life, a major event. So I'm writing her perspective, this needs to happen. And there's no historical facts about that. But, you know, you have to put it in, then kids get older. So time passes in my book about 15 years. So from, you know, this chapter, now I'm talking about this. Oh, wait, Marcellus is not a baby anymore. He's actually 13. So he's talking. And if he's at this party,
he's probably talking back.
Yeah, he's talking back now. So actually, I need to think about this. So I'm keeping track of all this stuff. So it's I had a separate document for the kids and the marriages and when they were born. And then I kept being like, okay, now it's this. Let me do the math. How old would they be? Like, they're both 13. Oh, they were actually they were already agreed by the families to be married. Okay, that's interesting. So you have this whole historical timeline. And then you start, you know, transitioning to chapters. I like to chapter outline. So I sort of sketch out, okay, I think I might take this many chapters. Definitely took more than what I was thinking. And then, you know, you're like, okay, I want this I switch perspectives. So it's like, well, who's going to tell this side of the story? What do I want this person to tell? Well, do I want this dinner from Cicero's perspective? Ooh, or Octavius, because they're going to be different. So you sort of go through and you are choosing. And then you also, what aspect of history? So much happens. What is worth telling? And sometimes it's not the obvious one. Sometimes it's not, you know, Battle of Philippi, have to include that. But maybe other battles don't even include that much. I can just say they did that. But actually it's more interesting for me to be with Agrippa after Attica gives birth or something like that. Maybe that's more interesting in that moment. And so you build the timeline, the chapter outline from the timeline. And then you start writing. And of course, like all the historical sources, all the scholarship I read, gives me these little like tidbits of information that are fun for me to weave in, almost like Easter eggs, so that it feels really rich for people who don't know that kind of stuff. But I think also for people who have read some of that scholarship in history, they're gonna be like, oh, I remember like there was a sort of rumor about that in historical sources. And now it's sort of, I tease it out a little bit as a possibility and all that kind of stuff. So it was really fun. It was hard though, but it was fun.
Yeah, I've written a book myself, and it is nowhere near the level of just like stuff that this book is. And I am just amazed at what you were able to accomplish. And it's cohesive and readable and enjoyable, like all at the same time. So nice job. What you mentioned about the kids is super interesting. What do we know about like what happened to some of these other kids? Like you mentioned like Livia's kid and some of Octavia's kids and like the other relationship that he had. But like, yeah, these kids, there were a lot of kids. Like what happened to these kids?
That could be a whole other novel that I've thought about.
I was heading in that direction.
It's daunting because there's so much that happens. So the most notorious result is definitely between Octavius and Scribonia's kid, which shouldn't come as a surprise if you think about their personalities. But Julia ends up marrying Agrippa. So if you think about that age difference, and they have, I think, 5 or 6 kids. One of the ultimate one after he dies. So he dies during that. He sort of dies young at that time even. I mean, Augustus lives to like 70 something. He dies at 50 something, maybe 60. But Julia ends up getting exiled sort of with Scribonia. I think Scribonia goes with her mother. But there's a huge drama there of scandals of her, you know, being unfaithful and having all these affairs with people. Other people get killed. Other people, there's a lot of drama. And that I couldn't possibly summarize unless it's in like another 500-page novel with multiple perspectives. And it's really clear. I mean, there's like actually romance, and then a love match that sort of gets broken up dramatically, and they're forced to marry other people, and that's a huge drama. And then Augustus obviously is like forming his imperial regime, and that's solidifying. And there's a lot of drama too with borders and things like that. So there's definitely another novel there, and I've considered it. And so maybe one day I'll think of starting that huge historical timeline.
That would be really awesome. I remember watching a movie about that. and how Julia was forced to marry Agrippa and then leave the other guy. And I can't remember what the name of the movie was now, but that does stand out. And it would be really, really interesting to get her perspective, a more in-depth perspective of like her motivations and like how she felt about it. Cause I think that definitely touches on, you know, our earlier comment about the sticky situations that women were placed in just because they were women and they were pawns, basically. So having her rebel against that and still manage to do what she wanted to do, that would be a fascinating book. I say right.
Oh, it's fast. And there's more to it for sure. There's other characters, Tiberius, Julius, Antony's, Mark Antony's son. They all play a huge role in that story. So
that would be fascinating. Now, did Cleopatra and Antony have a kid?
3, actually. And she had a son with Julius Caesar. So she was also definitely taking part. Actually, they had twins. They had twins, and they had a son. Supposedly, they all went. Well, definitely the twins went to Rome, and they were in the triumph, which Augustus Caesar celebrates after defeating Egypt. They have those 2 children, the twins, which were named Alexander Helios and Selene Cleopatra, so sort of like sun and moon, which honestly, really creative. Love those names. Yeah, they were chained. They were chained and walked as, you know, sort of the I guess the treasure, the booty that Augustus plundered from Egypt was those kids, and had them walk in chains in the triumph behind him. Throughout the city. So supposedly they went to live with Octavia, who was Mark Antony's last official wife. He does marry Cleopatra, but it's not recognized by the Roman people whatsoever. And it's probably part of his downfall. But she ends up with those kids. Supposedly also their youngest son goes to her. But those 3 end up sort of falling out of the historical record, so it's possible they were killed. We know that Selene, Cleopatra, the daughter, was married off to someone in the Near East, some king. So we don't know much about them, but it is interesting to think about. Kids with Cleopatra, with the kids with Octavia of Cleopatra. Yeah. Now you have these kids.
Really interesting.
And she has Mark Antony's kids from his other wife, not his first wife, just the previous one. Mark Antony's wife, Fulvia, who makes an appearance too. And she's interesting. But yeah.
Fascinating. It's almost like Octavia was just like this kind of like mother hen figure, like bring all the innocents to me and I'll protect them. Regardless of what kind of jerk, put you guys in this situation. That's actually really, really fascinating. Like
she never married again. She just had all these kids.
Interesting. Kind of makes you wonder, like, what were her true feelings for Mark Antony? Like, maybe she really loved the guy and was like, I'm gonna, whatever.
I know. That's hard to say.
Fascinating. I love it. That's really interesting. I'm gonna have to like do some deep diving into Octavia more now, just because that is a really interesting story there. So we do have a question in the comments. This is from Grace. Grace asks, is there a part of the book or particular scene that you wish you could have included but didn't make the final draft?
Ooh, that's interesting. Let me think about that. I think given how long the book is, I put a lot in there. So there was a lot that I wanted that got in there. I think what I was sort of sad I couldn't just keep going on and on and on for 1,000 pages is the latter half of Augustus's life. That's sort of, if this is considered sort of the first part, and maybe that's better in a sequel because you can focus on the kids. But it is interesting how Augustus and Agrippa's relationship unfolds later. There's actually a scene where I say scene as if I'm already like constructing it in my mind. A historical fact, I should say, that when Augustus is riddled by illnesses since since he was born. He was sort of known for that, being sort of sickly, which is funny because he ends up having so much power. So if you put your mind to it, you can do anything. So he was sick at some point. He was like maybe between late 30s, 40s, 50s, like around that time. And he's really ill. He thinks he's going to die. And he has a signet ring, and he bequeaths it supposedly with his power as, the power of the Roman Republic, if you can call it that, the Roman Empire at that point. And he bequeaths it not to Marcellus, who everyone assumed was his heir. Marcellus is his sister Octavia's son. And he's sort of set up as this golden child. He's going to be the heir of the empire, and everyone loves him. He's, this princeling, essentially. He doesn't do that. He says, no, I want Agrippa to have the signet ring. He's going to be the competent one who can actually manage an empire. And then when Agrippa suddenly dies, and Octavius tries to race to him to, be there when he dies, he doesn't make it. So Agrippa dies coming back from the east, and he's trying to get back home. He doesn't make, so they don't, see each other again. And he goes into mourning for like over a month, and then Agrippa gets buried in Augustus's family mausoleum, which you can go see and tour in Rome. I went. The tour was in Italian. However, you get to walk around. It's preserved partly because it was ended up being used throughout the centuries for different things, as most Roman ruins were, and that's how they get preserved. Usually, is they're converted into a church or used for some military thing. Quite common, actually. But yeah, you can go tour it. So Augustus was buried there, and so was Agrippa. And I just wish that I had the time. And then also Marcellus dying, and Octavia, and how she must have felt. And then all of the kind of drama with those other characters. But I wish I could have spent more time with the adults that I had, their relationships and characters that I had cultivated in this book. But the sequel has to be about the children. So that's why I think I can say that that's what I wish I could include. Like, I wish I could write those scenes, but I don't think I ever will. I think if I wrote a sequel, I'd focus on the next generation. But it is interesting to think about how that book would continue on if I kept telling it from Augustus and Agrippa and Livia's perspectives, because a lot happens.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. I really love that you can still tour that and see that. And so when you went there, did you already have this story in your head? Had you already started writing it?
Yeah, I started writing it early on that semester when I was studying abroad, and I was going to all these places. I tell people this story because it is true. When I was walking through the Roman Forum, I was trying to think of a title. And of course, it was in the Roman Forum that it seemed like lightning struck. And I had this idea for the Son of God because, to explain this title, Augustus sort of identified himself with Apollo, which partly represents the sun. And so that's where the son comes in, but it's the Son of God because he ends up being the son of a god, Julius Caesar, who is deified. And so he plays on both of those. And so my title plays on both of those things. And it is playing a little bit off of the more common Son of God that we know, because the story is actually, it's interesting because Jesus as a historical figure was born during Augustus's lifetime, which is a weird thing to think about because we don't think of those two figures the same way, but they were sort of, contemporaries.
That is interesting.
And they both had a sort of Son of God story. Just one became a religion, and this one was at the tail end of that. So yeah. It was a religion in its own right, technically. So
that is really fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the Apollo aspect too, because it was Augustus that contracted Virgil to write the Aeneid and trace his line back to Aphrodite. So he was really playing the divine blood aspect a lot. So
and
from
supposedly
angles.
Some of these historical historians will write Augustus's birth, which if you think about Mother Mary, just think about that story. Supposedly later on, these historians were like, well, actually, Attica, Balba, who is Octavius's mom, slept, had a dream or something about this serpent as Apollo coming, and she wakes up pregnant, and it was a god. It wasn't Gaius Octavius. It was a god, and miraculous birth. And so these later historians were like positing this story on him, which is, they were part, these writers were writing in an imperial regime, so they couldn't say anything bad, but they were basically constructing this whole mythology. So that's also why there's a danger in trusting some of these historical sources, because then I would have to write, if I trusted it, and I'm like, well, this is what happened, then I would have to write the story like, he was born like that. But no one thought that at the time. It was a later propaganda-esque story that arose to legitimize his divinity.
Yeah. Wow, that is super fascinating. I hadn't heard the snake dream aspect before, but that's really interesting.
There's another one where supposedly when Augustus dons his toga virilis, which is when he basically becomes a man at like 14, and you do it in front of I think you do it on the rostra. You do it in front of like the Senate, basically. And as he's getting dressed, I think let me see if I can say this correctly. I think his dress, like the toga, falls, and everyone sort of tries to take it as a bad omen. And he says, "No, this is a prophecy that the Senate will fall at my feet later."
Way to recover from an embarrassing.
Yeah.
Like standing naked in front of my classmates trope.
Yeah, but instead, no. It means the Senate will fall at his feet later. And it does. But that story is...
That's wild.
Later. Who knows? But you have to take those stories with a grain of salt. But that's another good one.
That is a really good one, yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your awesome book. This is historical gold. So if you have ever been interested in Augustus Caesar and how he rose to power and the relationships and just ancient Rome in general, this is jam-packed with awesome research and great conflict, character building. Like this is a novel that is awesome. So check out the SASA's bookshop. This QR code goes to SASA's bookshop. Where to go? Every purchase from there does go to support directly to, let me get my words under control here. Every purchase from the bookshop goes to support SASA and other small bookstores. So if you are going to get you a copy, use this QR code. I also want to put a plug in for SASA's Halloween Bash events. We are doing a bunch of other live events and other fundraising fun stuff surrounding ancient history beginning on the 24th of October, which is in 4 days. So click the QR code and go see what events we have lined up and RSVP to a couple. But that is our time, this book club. So thank you again so much, Zoe. I really enjoyed this story, and this was really fun talking to you. I really hope that we can get a Julia/Octavia story.
We'll see. I'll think about it.
Okay.
And then, and if people want to, they can go to my website, just zoetavaresbennett.com, and you can subscribe to my newsletter where I have updates about things. And also there's a hardcover with like this cool little, and on the back, there's also someone else. So check it out.
I believe this QR code goes to Zoe's website, where you can get that hardcover edition, which is super cool. I just have a paperback, so I may have to invest in the hardcover for my bookshelf because hardcovers are awesome. But thank you so much, Zoe.